So my name is Tim Kern, and I'm the treasurer of the Haley Library. I'm also the chair of the Big Wood River Library Districting Project, which some of you may have heard of, and if you haven't heard of it now, you soon will. I'm also a professor emeritus in history and history education, recently retired from a 33-year career at California State University, Long Beach. Boo hiss, yes, he's from California, but my family's been here since the 1930s, so I have some kudos. In my capacity as a Haley Library trustee and as a history educator, I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening, Tony, and you're going to correct me, Tekaroniake? Wow, great. I used to run the India Studies program at our school, and I was really good at South Asian names, not Mohawk. Evans. So we're really happy to have Tony here. I suspect that many of you know Tony already. I can just tell by the banter in the room. Tony obviously lives within our community as an award-winning reporter and columnist for the Idaho Mountain Express. He's lived in the Wood River Valley for 35 years, and I believe you live in Haley, correct? Just down the road. Perfect. Okay. Tony's an enrolled member of the Ganyanawaki, a Mohawk First Nations Reserve in Quebec, adjacent to Montreal. And he is one of the communities, and this is one of the communities making up the transnational Mohawk Nation, which is within the Iroquois Confederation. And the Mohawk Nation is across both borders. Well, I'll keep my tariff comments to myself. Before finding his way to Idaho, Tony grew up, traveled, and resided at a number of very diverse locations: New York City, Quebec, the American Virgin Islands, rural Georgia, Boulder, Colorado, where he obtained his degree in cultural anthropology, India, New Mexico. Sure, I missed a few places. All have informed his writing and his identity. His articles, reports, and essays cover a plethora of topics from local government and nonprofits in Blaine County, as exciting as that is, to religion and spirituality, travel literature, and of course, history. In addition to the Mountain Express, Tony's a contributor to a number of other publications, including the Smithsonian American Indian Magazine, High Country News, History.com, and the Boise Weekly. Tony's also the author of a number of books, including 2 published by Washington State University, all of which are for sale after he speaks. To my left, the first from Washington State University is Teaching Native Pride, which was published in 2020. And his recent, and I'm going to call it a memoir, his recent memoir of sorts, Believing in Indians, A Mixed Blood Odyssey. I just finished reading this book, and I highly recommend it. And I just met Tony, so this is not some kind of scam to sell his books, okay? This book is really good, right? Exactly. I get like 7%. Is that what we agreed on? Yeah, exactly. It's a wonderful read. It's an exploration and personal narrative of the unpredictable development and trajectory of indigenous identity consciousness, and it's both poignant and extremely funny. And we've talked, there's some very funny bits that I can relate to because I'm not that much older than him, but I'm not going to say it in, you can go ahead and say it. Fair enough. In my view, the book makes an important contribution to our understanding of indigenous identity formation for those of Native American heritage not raised on the reservation. And I make this point because the majority of people who identify as Native American do not live on reservations. The state of California has the largest Native American population in the United States by a significant number, and most people of Native identity live in cities, towns, rural communities. I ran a huge credential program in California, 2,000 students. We had 1 student every year who identified as Native American. So I think it's a really important story about how people not on the reservation develop their identity consciousness. Tonight, Tony will also be speaking from his A History of Indians in the Sun Valley area. I think it's right there, yep. That was published in collaboration with the Blaine County Museum and is based on a series of articles he wrote for the Idaho Mountain Express. Importantly, it's been used as a text in the Blaine County School District. The book details the indigenous history of our area from thousands of years ago to, most importantly, the present. It challenges notions that Indians were part of the local past but not part of the present, and it also challenges the notions that Indians simply passed through our region and never settled. I recently was in the Chalice Museum, and they have all these interesting artifacts that are Shoshone or Bannock or ancestral to them. And I asked the woman where they were from. Well, we don't know because they just passed through here. And I thought, they sure dropped a lot of stuff on their way. But in any event, I think that's an important point that comes out of his book. An important point for teachers and their students is drawn from the book as well, that the Shoshone-Bannock and their ancestors were here, and I put this in bold, and are still here, right, contributing to our community. It's hoped that this book signing and Q&A session and his discussion will further our discussion and understanding and significance of Native history in the Wood River Valley. Please join me in welcoming Tony Evans. Let me get out of your way.
How's the sound? You guys hear me okay? Okay, okay. A little more, a little higher? Volume. I'm going to try and use my grown-up voice. Hold, I can move this.
Hello, hello.
Better? Yes. Okay. Well, I want to start by saying Sego Sawagwego. Hello. Hello, everyone. I might be using some Mohawk words tonight. I think it's important to use our language because people have gone through a lot to preserve language and culture in Indian nations. So, Sego Sawagwego Nyo Goa, thank you very much for being here. It's really nice to see your smiling faces, including a lot of friends. It's great to be talking about this book in my hometown. 7 years now since it was published. And I'd like to begin with, well, let's look at the pictures. This is when the book came out. And this was at the community library in Ketchum. This is young Chief Washakie. He came from the Wind River Reservation where his father lives. His mother works at the Indian Health Service in Fort Hall. And young Chief honored me with a visit when I brought out this book for the first time. He happens also to be on the cover of the book. And young Chief is wearing a headdress that's 125 years old at the time and belonged to Chief Washakie's. It belonged to Chief Washakie. So, and if you don't know about Chief Washakie, just Google him or grab a book or something. A very important person from the Wind River Reservation. The Shoshone people have a vast territory, and it does stretch clear into Wyoming, north toward the Canadian border, and back in the day, I think pretty much to the west coast. So I'm going to be talking about what happens when a curious journalist gets involved in a story in his hometown, which resulted in this book of mine. Also, I'll point out, standing next to young Chief is, this is my mother, Tekaroniake Evans. She was born on the reservation and has taken us there many times, and I've learned a great deal about her, about our culture and our relatives from her. She's also my publicist, and she's in the audience today. Her middle name, Tekaroniake, her Mohawk name, Tekaroniake, means she sends in Mohawk. We changed that during the 1990s to she faxes. And most recently it is she emails and texts. So if you ever, be careful giving her your cell phone number. I'll just warn you. Also to the right of young Chief is Evelyn Phillips, my dear friend and book designer, who helped put this book together back in the day, and we had it printed right here at Copy and Print. There are no digital versions of this book as of yet, and it is coming out in a new printing at Washington State University Press, which has published 2 of my books now. They're putting that in their catalog, and it will be for sale at the Blaine County Historical Museum, where it has been for sale for years and years. So, the reason that I wrote this book. I wasn't exactly clear on this reason when I started it, but I did come to realize after a few weeks or months what was motivating me. And I want to tell this quick story before I get started, because as was mentioned, I wasn't living on the reservation when I was a young kid. I knew I was Mohawk. I had a middle name, Tekaroniake. This is my great-grandfather gave me this name. I knew who I was and I knew where I was from, and yet I was displaced because my mother, well, she likes to travel, and she also liked to remarry. So we wound up in the Deep South, in Georgia, from where I was originally. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, which is where the Mohawks have had a presence for a very long time. Mohawks build the skyscrapers in New York City. Some of the big buildings on the Manhattan skyline are there thanks to Mohawk steelworkers. But I was living in Georgia, and I think I was in 3rd grade when we were learning all about the very first Thanksgiving. And we had picture up on the overhead projector. Some of you guys are old enough to remember those. And the teacher, my dear teacher, was showing us pictures of Indians and talking about the first Thanksgiving and how the native people helped the pilgrims who had come to America, the Puritans, and landed at Plymouth Rock, where Plymouth cars were built, I figured, you know. And I'm listening to this story, and I'm looking at these pictures of Indians, and some of the kids in the back of the room said, "Where are all the Indians, you know? Where are they now? Where are they now?" And I piped up, you know, I'd only been in town a year or two, and I said, I'm Indian. And they all turned around to look at me, and my teacher looked at me, and she said, "Tony, stop telling stories. We all know that the Indians were here once, that they lived in teepees. We know, but they're gone now. We all know that the Indians are gone." And I said, "Well, where did they go?" And she said, "Well, they've all melted into the great melting pot of America." Now, this was just before 1970, I believe, or right around 1970 or 71. And this was in a period in American history of assimilation. That was the official policy of the federal government. It was also a policy of erasure that had been underway for generations. So Native history was never celebrated or even brought to the surface in the minds of school children. Now, I went home and I said to Mom, "Are you sure we're Indian?" And this, well, she got a little upset. She pulled out books and, you know, photograph albums, started telling me stories. She said, who is this teacher? And she went to the school and talked to my teacher. Now, it was a teaching moment, let's say, for my teacher. But my dear teacher simply did not know. And as I started working on this book, some of those memories came back. And I started jotting down in my notes stories from my own life. I'd never written a memoir, but I did know that I wanted to finish this series of articles in the Idaho Mountain Express newspaper. Because I was at the newspaper one day, and I was probably 5 years into my work there, and my editor at the time, Greg Foley, he said, "You know, you need to do a series story every year, you know, a series of 3 or 4 articles. We're all doing it." He said, "Why don't you go?" He said, "You're a native guy, right?" I said, "Yeah." Greg and I both went to the University of Colorado. We've got a lot in common. And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Go write about the native people of this area. Go write about the Indians in Sun Valley. Where are they?" I said, "Heck if I know. I'm writing about the Chinese. I'm writing about miners. I'm writing about the Basque." But there was really nothing around about the native people. I had already been to a powwow in Fort Hall with some family members. I knew there were native history here. So, long story short, I wrote the articles. Mike Healy, a retired school teacher in town here, who I really want to extend some gratitude to, he saw the articles. He said, "Let's make those into a book." I said, "Well, okay." And he became my editor, and we gathered more information. I made more and more friends at Fort Hall. I went back to another powwow. I went to the Language and Cultural Preservation Department. I followed the protocols of working with tribal authorities before you write a history. This is a very important thing to do, in case you're wondering. And so here's the book. And what I'm most grateful for is when I found out that the Blaine County School District is using this book in their curriculums. Sorry. I'm emotional sometimes. But the point is that that mistake that frankly traumatized me quite a bit when I was a kid, I don't think it's going to happen here. Okay? Because if a kid in the audience says, "Hey, I'm Quechua," or "I'm Native," or "I'm Indigenous," the teacher's likely to know by now. And they'll probably just ask him, "Hey, what tribe you from?" And it could become a conversation. Although I will say that we are in a new era now. I was lucky enough to go to college during the multicultural era, very liberal era with regard to education. Things are changing right now, and I just want to leave it at that. I'm sure some of you might understand. So, Indian country, Native America, it's a very big, complicated place. There are so many tribes. When I was in college 40 years ago, there were more than 100 federally recognized Indian nations, and I thought that was a big number. I studied anthropology, learned about many, many kinds of people. Recently, indigenous cultures have been looked to for leadership in environmental conservation. And it's about time. There's 300 or 400 million indigenous people around the world. The Biden White House issued an executive order. It came to my news desk, and I ended up, talking and writing about it, that elevated indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in land use planning in the United States on all of our public lands. The Ford Foundation issued a study a few years before that showing that if you want to protect the most biologically diverse areas on Earth, you protect the people who live there. So this is something that I write about in my next book. This is our reserve, Kahnawake. When I was a kid, it was called Kaukanawaga. I don't know why it's changed. Maybe that's the Brooklyn pronunciation, because a lot of my relatives were from Brooklyn. It means by the rapids, and we are based on the St. Lawrence River, right outside of Montreal. This is a Google Earth view, so you can see the stark delineation there between the Mohawk land on the left. This is a little piece of art that I made. And not Mohawk land on the right, which is the suburbs, south of Montreal, Chateauguay and Lachine and others. That lack of development there is due to, ecological mindset, I'm sure, but also strict immigration controls. A lot of people would like to live on our land but cannot. And that's because it is protected sovereign territory that needs to be defended, by the way, from time to time. Several million people live north of our reserve in Montreal. Big, big world-class city. And the reserve of Kahnawake has been called the lungs of Montreal because of all the green there. This is downtown. Last time I was in town, I think it was just before COVID. I was going to my uncle's wedding. And we got a very beautiful old town from early 1700s. There's a fantastic old Catholic church mission there that's built about that time. It's a wonderful place to visit. It was 200 years, really, before Lewis and Clark came out west and came through this area later, the miners, the trappers. 200 years earlier, we were contacted. So that's the kind of diversity in terms of acculturation that's taken place across Turtle Island, across North America. And yet, there are many, many things similar, no matter which native people that you might happen to meet. My wife is also from an Iroquois nation, or a Haudenosaunee nation. And by the way, the Mohawks are the Ganyankahaga, and the language is the Ganyankaha. And the Tuscarora are the Skaruri. But they are also members of, these are two nations in the Six Nation Confederacy, which includes the Mohawk, but also all of the other five. Tuscaroras were the last to come in. The Onondaga Nation is the Grand Council up around Syracuse, New York, that area. And the Tuscarora have a different way, slightly, of doing things. Every nation is different. You know, we have different values, different governments. This is a picture from when we went to a Tuscarora picnic some years ago at my wife's res, and it was a wonderful time. What I learned when I was there is that they are a little bit more traditional than the Ganawage Mohawks in some very important sense. Only women can own land at the Tuscarora Reservation. How many people think that's a good idea? Almost all the women. But I do too, actually. And that is a tradition, the matriarchal, matrilineal tradition of the Iroquois peoples. But I'll just ask you to think for a second about how that might change a society. You know, men are all over the place doing the usual things, you know, mowing lawns and commuting for work, but they never own the home they live in. It is passed down from eldest sister to eldest sister to eldest sister. Just one of those interesting details. Creation stories are important to me as a writer, as a human being. I think because I was influenced by religion when I was quite young, and it wasn't always a positive influence, but it got me thinking, and it got me wondering really about origins, our origins, and where we're from. You've probably heard of the creation story of Adam and Eve in a garden and being cast out of that garden for eating a certain fruit. There's so many ways to interpret this story, especially as we get older. But when I was young, I was exposed to this story about the time I was exposed to the idea of Armageddon, the apocalypse, heaven and hell, where certain people dear to me were going to spend a life in eternity in hell. That got me concerned and worried and also curious. About the same time, 1973 or so, the Ganawage Mohawks took back control of the education system. There's a nice long story about that. I don't go into any detail about it. But I was living off the reservation. I had learned that Indians had gone extinct. Meanwhile, some of the leaders in our community were bringing their children home and taking over the education of their own children on our reservation. And I started getting books from my Uncle Ed Tuax, who was a great teacher for me. And I started hearing stories and listening to stories and learning about the Longhouse and the traditions that go on in the Longhouse, which are extraordinary to me. And it became, for me, a very important alternate creation story in the world. One that involves a woman who came down from the spirit world. She was with child. It might have happened on her way over the eons that it took her to land. But she became exposed to this vast world of water. There was no land anywhere. Where was she going to land? The animals came out and they took care of her. So many different animal creatures are involved in the creation story. And they were the muskrat, key among them. I believe that's this fellow right here. He was the one who finally made it down deep enough to grab the mud off the bottom and to put it on the back of the turtle. Lots of it. And this was a big turtle. And the turtle became Turtle Island. Maybe you've heard that expression. It's widely used across Indian country. But far as I know, it came from the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee. There are very many similar creation stories in that part of the world, and even out west I've found recently in my studies and in my travels. So eventually things happened, a lot of things happened. I did a teaching online a couple of years ago, and it took 40 hours for this culture teacher to tell the creation story. 40 hours over the course of 2 months. So many psychological and spiritual aspects to it, very, very important. Just as the story of Genesis and in the Bible is very, very important. And can be read in many, many different ways, right? There was a big wrestling match at the dawn of creation. A lot of things followed from that. I won't have time to go into any detail there. But here's one small detail that I want to share with you that I'm always fascinated by. Turtle Island. The world is occurring on the back of a turtle. This is a turtle rattle, a turtle back, a turtle shell. And some of you may know, if you ever look at a turtle shell and you count the number of plates, large plates, there's always 13 large plates. Now those plates correspond cosmologically to the Iroquois worldview and to practices, agricultural practices, because we are agricultural people, growing the corn, beans, and squash. Those are 13 months in the lunar calendar. And if you look on the outside of the turtle shell, there are 28 small plates. Those 28 plates are days in the lunar calendar. So this is a calendar that far predates the Julian calendar that we go by now, or the several others that came up during Roman times. And there are adjustments to it to keep, the lunar calendar working. I don't know too many details, but my dear friend Steve McCumber, who's a Iroquois seed saver, and also he's on the council now, he taught me some things when I was a teenager. Well, he understands this in depth. And he travels a great deal, and he collects seeds from all the 6 Iroquois nations. Many, many, many different varieties that have been grown over all the years. There are other teachings associated with the turtle shell and the turtle back. But for me, it's an amazing correlation between the universe and this creature. And I find it uncanny that the turtle shell is a living calendar for the lunar calendar, the planning of the Iroquois people. I've learned a little bit since I was in grade school and was told that Indians, had all gone away, and I'm really grateful that I have. I'm beginning to feel like it's set me on a path in my life that's meaningful. About that first Thanksgiving, I do write for A&E Global Networks now, A&E Media it was called until last year, and my wonderful editor there, Missy Sullivan in New York City. And I took this assignment as soon as I could grab it. It was writing about that first Thanksgiving among the Wampanoags and the early European English settlers. And I found out how much very, very more interesting this story really is. I had learned about Squanto, the native man who welcomed the Europeans in and gave them sustenance, allowed them to survive here on Turtle Island. But what I didn't know was, and I never thought to ask, well, how did Squanto talk to these people? He's an indigenous guy from North America, and these are Englishmen on ships. Well, Squanto was actually Tisquantum, and he was a Wampanoag, and the plagues were just starting across North America that ended up killing maybe 80 or 90% of the inhabitants of North America over the course of a period of time. The plagues were beginning. And Squanto was whisked away by a ship when he was a young man and sold into slavery in Spain. 5.5 million Native Americans were enslaved during the period of slavery. These are the kind of things you find out as an adult and you go, oh. Squanto, Tisquantum, made his way back to the New World. He was rescued by Jesuits. Through a series of events, he wound up living and working with these British merchants who were very curious about the New World, of course, because it was becoming the hot new place to go, make your life. And he wound up back in America speaking English when that ship came by. The stories of history are so much more interesting when we have a chance or the time, to dig into it a little bit. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to work for A&E Networks. They are doubling down on the, let's say, unspoken corners of American history at a time when the federal government is shutting down websites and perhaps, I dare say, whitewashing American history in some sense. Because some people apparently, I've never met one, who are feeling uncomfortable about the stories, like the stories I'm sharing with you today. It's important that we know history. It's important that we know the hard stuff so we don't repeat it. It's as simple as that. Children can handle it. So, I eventually addressed that early Thanksgiving story in my grade school years, and it felt nice. I've also written about the Mohawks in New York City. Mohawks built the skyline. They worked on some of the very big, famous buildings, the Empire State, the Chrysler Building, Rockefeller Plaza. My grandfather, Julian Robbins, worked there because he married into the Mohawks. My mother's great uncle Tom worked on the high steel. And so it's a tradition and it's ongoing still. Mohawks are really good at this job. People say they're not afraid of heights. I'm afraid of heights. But I blame that on my Irish and Jewish relatives. It's probably a genetic thing. I was on assignment a few years ago to Yellowstone National Park, and they were celebrating the 150th anniversary of Yellowstone National Park. And at the time, Charles Sams, who I greatly admire, he's a native man from the Northwest, was in charge of the National Park Service in the United States. And he was working for Deb Haaland, who is in charge of the Department of the Interior of the United States. Vastly influential positions in America and America's land use. And Charles Sams had brought about this project to celebrate the native history of Yellowstone National Park. I had never been to Yellowstone National Park. And I finally felt like I had a reason to go there. So I went. I took this assignment. There's no longer 100 or 150 Native American Indian nations. There's 574 nations. This is my friend Chris Lachey. We met him there at the park, my brother and I. And he's a member of the Little Shell Chippewa. And he showed me his tattoo, and I took a picture of it. 574. He is a member of the latest federally recognized nation in America. And he's also was, at the time, the Poet Laureate of Montana, and he's since come out with a book called Becoming Little Shell. It's a remarkable book. I read it this spring or winter, and it's a story about the effort to become a federally recognized tribe. I hope you'll all remember that title, and maybe we can get Chris Lachey to come here and do a talk sometime. But it's also a memoir, and it's heartfelt, and it's a wonderful history of his people in Montana. And that's my brother Chris. He's my bodyguard when I'm on assignment. And we were there at Madison Junction in Yellowstone on the Firehole River. Many, many tribes came, put up teepees, you can see them in the background there, and talked to people all summer long, visitors who came. It was amazing and so educational, and well, that's that story's been written on Atmos, and I've also covered it in my new book as well. So, as I'm saying, Indian country is a very complicated place. I'm a big fan of creation stories. I spoke to some Chumash people recently out around Santa Barbara in California. They come from the islands, the Channel Islands. That's where they came from. And they crossed a bridge, a rainbow bridge, to Turtle Island at some point in their past. And they were warned before they crossed the bridge, don't look down. Just don't look down. Well, some people, of course, looked down. They became porpoises. That's where dolphins, porpoises come from. There's other tribes. I'll tell you about the Taos Pueblo, where I started out as a journalist in the 1990s. They originated at Blue Lake, I'm told, behind the Sacred Mountain in Taos. If you ever go to Taos, you can't miss the Sacred Mountain. It is right there in the middle of everything. There's Spirit Cave, where I believe it's in Wyoming, I'm not sure, but several tribes originated from Spirit Cave, deep underground. And the other southwestern tribes came from underground, or have lived in successive iterations of creation. 3 worlds, 4 worlds that have come into being and then dissolved, learning things at each step, at each iteration, over eons. So I love the diversity of Native American cultures, cosmologies, outlooks, faiths. Diversity is a good thing, despite what you might have heard recently. But it's very hard to know what Native people in general want or in general think or believe. You know, you often hear, what is it? What is it that ties Indians together? All of what can you say about Native people? I've given this some thought, and I've done some research too, and I've found out that there's only one thing that really works across all traditional borders. They all love Bill Murray. They all love Bill Murray. I don't know, I don't get it either, but it's true. So if you want to get in with some Indians, just start talking about Caddyshack, Ghostbusters, Saturday Night Live. It'll be good. Just kidding. Okay, I know why you're here. We're going back to Sun Valley. I'm going to tell you a history, an alternative history of Sun Valley. Skier's paradise. Wonderful place where we live. Sun Valley started in, 1936? I'm going to go back just a little further. I think this book began in my head with a drive I used to take, we all take, all the time, Galena Summit. There was a sign there until very recently, and from the very first time I read that sign, it just kind of bugged me, because it reads that searching the mountain wilderness for beaver, Alexander Ross came up the Wood River Valley and discovered this summit in 1824. And I looked at that word discovered so many times. I must have commented to friends about it, and I thought, I just want to strike that word. That's so doctrine of discovery. That's so erasure. How? If people are living here for thousands and thousands of years, how could this Scottish school teacher, intrepid and admirable adventurer that he was, discover Galena Summit and discover the Sawtooth Valley, which lay beyond, which for a moment or two he believed he had discovered the whole shebang? And I think the way he describes it in his memoir, which I did research before the internet, by the way, and I had to go to a library, get a book on loan, I can't remember, it's Fur Trappers of the Far West. He wrote it in the 1850s or 60s when he was living in Red River. And he said, for a moment there, we imagined that, and he had Indian guides with him the whole way, and I'm convinced he was following trails the whole way, probably, and directions too. But for a moment he envisioned that he was the first human to ever lay eyes on this pristine and enormously Edenic sort of valley, you know. That's the great wish, I think, you know, returning to Eden, finding, you know, Eden again. And then he looks down off his horse and he sees a grouse with an arrow stuck in it, and it's still flopping around on the ground. And he's like, uh-oh, well, we're being watched. You know, we're not the first ones here. I found that to be a sort of comical scene, and so I wrote that in the first scene of my book, the first pages of my book. I also did some other research in the area, and I found other signs, and I started taking interest in historical signs. Here's one. Captain John Stanley had a party of 23 men discovered gold near this spot. Remote country, due to the remote country and roving Indians, forced the men to leave without working their discovery. Well, they came back the next year, and pretty soon the entire area was abloom with mines, and it led for the next 20, 30 years, extraordinary gold rush, silver rush. Mining is probably why any of us are here to begin with. Roving Indians. Native people move around with the game, you know. You're not going to find camas bulbs growing in January in the Sawtooth Valley. You go further south. Well, anyway, Indians do still rove in the Sawtooth Valley. That's my wife. She's roving. We do it on mountain bikes. We still rove around. It was what's really ironic, when I started writing this book, I'm in a newsroom with some very smart people, very well-educated people. And I've heard again and again and again, well, the Indians only ever just came through. They never really lived here. They just came through. And I thought, well, that's living here, coming through. But they never spent the winter. I kept hearing that in the news. They never spent the winter. You know, we spend the winter. And the irony is that, you know, of course, Sun Valley is full of snowbirds. I mean, half that town leaves every year. Right? But they followed seasonal food sources. And there's a calendar. My friend Leo Arrowhite likes to show me about all of the subsistence patterns. These were migratory people. They moved a great deal. They weren't settled in one place. But this sign is the one that really caught the attention from me enough to write the book and eventually to write a story about Alexander Ross this came out in High Country News. And I got tipped off by somebody at the state archaeology department that said, we're rewriting highway signs and we're talking to native people for the first time. Bing! There's a story here. And I got on the phone with Nolan Brown. I found out that they're working with all 5 tribes in Idaho. That the signs were originally created in the 1950s without any input from native people at all. And some of them are quite compelling, and yet some of them are quite ethnocentric or demeaning. And I talked to Nolan Brown, I talked to Nakiah Williamson of the Nez Perce tribe, and they gave me enough quotes, you know, to write a story for High Country News. Decolonizing Idaho road signs. And I started right with my Scottish school teacher, Alexander Ross, in that article, which was good fun. Well, the story caught the attention of Smithsonian Magazine and other magazines, and I found out that there was a real interest. And I do believe still there is a deep interest in Native American history in the United States. I think it's only just begun to be told. So Smithsonian Magazine, Idaho's campaign to include indigenous historic markers. As a reporter, you're never supposed to become the story, but in this case, I somehow became part of the story, which is kind of a no-no in journalism. But it was fun, because I got interviewed by Scott Tong at Here and Now in Boston, you know, and here I am, you know, in my pajamas at home, talking into my computer to this, you know, big radio hero. And anyway, it was, I'm still following this story. This is how it looks up there these days, up on Galena Summit. That sign went missing, and I've been accused of stealing it more than once. It wasn't me. I don't know where it went. I asked around town as I'm writing my story, and my friend Wayne at High Desert Sports, which was down here, down the block until recently, Wayne said, "Have you seen the old picture of the Indian trails?" And I said, "No." He said, "It's a map. It's a mining map." Well, where is it? There's another copy at the Blaine County Historical Museum. And what we did is we highlighted the old Indian trail as it's written. This is I think it's a Rand McNally or something. It's like really, really early on mining map cartographers. This one comes down into Ketchum. This is Trail Creek Road, the old mining trail, old Indian trail. During the mining era, Native people were allowed to pass on that trail without paying a toll. There used to be a toll at the Galena summit. Non-Indians would dress up like Indians to try to sneak through. That's in my book. Here's another trail that came down from the North Fork. This is the SNRA Visitor Center here. I've often hiked up there wondering where exactly the trail is. It's not clear to me where it is. Here's the other old Lemhi trail that came into Bellevue. Anyway, these trails are mentioned and called out in the book. It gave me a little sense of orientation and also confirmed what I already knew. I also called the Language and Cultural Preservation Department at Fort Hall. I interviewed people like Velda Racehorse and Carolyn Boyer Smith. And I was saying, "Do you know where there's any more old Indian trails in the Wood River Valley?" She said, "Yeah. You ever heard of Highway 75? Oh, yeah. She said, "We used to use that one to get over Galena Summit," the one that Alexander Ross discovered. So I used to use that to get into the Salmon River Valley. They didn't call it the Sawtooth Valley. It's the Salmon River Valley. They were there for the salmon. They have a very important connection with the salmon. The stories are extraordinary. And I'm working on a documentary right now with the Shoshone-Bannock tribes about their efforts to recover the sawtooth sockeye, which are the longest swimming, migrating fish from the ocean anywhere in the lower 48. 900 miles they spawn at the headwaters of the Salmon River. I also found out about the redfish overhang, which is, archaeologists don't advertise where important sites are, but I did happen to find out where this is. And even if you never go there, just understand that it's a sacred site, that it has been in use for 10,000 years. There are paintings, petroglyphs within the redfish overhang that have been vandalized. I found this out when I went to go visit it one day, and a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes came to, ask me what I was doing there, and we had a good conversation. Timothy Wildcat Haskett, by the way, whose grandfather was a fiddler and was way into looking for arrowheads and points. And actually, the Haskett tool level, the Haskett, how should I say it, the Haskett technology, which has been described, is named after him, Parley Haskett. Camas Prairie, I found out, is probably the most important place in our area with regard to the Shoshone and Bannock tribes, and I've heard many other tribes as well, because this was a gathering place since time immemorial for people to forage and to gather camas, which are blooming here, probably late May or early June. This is the starchy food product that allowed Lewis and Clark to survive when the Nez Perce instructed them how to, you have to bake it underground for a long, long time, otherwise it's toxic. But it tastes like candy when it's done correctly. My brother and I have even roasted it, and it's really quite a thing. It's you can preserve it all winter long. But it was also a very important place, and I found out that the Shoshone and Bannock tribes have a lot of stories relating to Camas Prairie, Great Camas Prairie. And yet, during the era of European migration through, It was being destroyed by livestock. Eventually, there was a treaty drawn up that guaranteed Camas Prairie to the Shoshone-Bannock. That treaty turned out to be a bit of a scam because they misspelled the word Camas as Kansas. Many would say intentionally. And these native people did not see or know or understand the difference. They were defrauded out of Camas Prairie. Now, this isn't just some obscure piece of history that I came upon. The founder of the city of Haley, John Haley, went to Washington, D.C. to lobby to get that land back to the Shoshone-Bannocks. That's how commonly known this is. And the Shoshone-Bannock, I would not doubt, still have a claim, for that area. They certainly go there. They still go there. They have always gone there. Even when it was deadly for them to leave the reservation, they have still gone back. This is Chief Buffalo Horn, who led a resistance to take back Camas Prairie after the people incarcerated on a reservation for the first time were being starved to death by the U.S. government. General Crook, he's a famous Indian fighter. The Bannock War of 1878, a lot was written about it as one of the last great Indian wars in the West. The Nez Perce War in Chief Joseph, it happened a year earlier in northern Idaho. General Crook, he said, our Indian policy has resolved itself into a question of warpath or starvation. And being merely human, many of them will always choose the former alternative when death will at least be glorious. Coming from General Crook, that means something. I met some other friends. I was wrapping the book up, and this is Sarah Sunshine Manning on the left, and her father, Lindsay Manning. He was chairman of the Shoshone-Paiute tribes down in Duck Valley. We had a friend in common, Sarah and I. I was friends with her uncle. And so I ended up tracking her down when she was in town for a film festival, and I interviewed these guys. And one of the things Lindsay told me, he said, do you know about the Oahe Avalanche article? And I said, no. And he said, I need to show it to you. And I found a documentary eventually. It's kind of a bad reproduction of the wording, but this is an actual scan of an article from 1878, the Oahe Avalanche from Oahe country. That for every black scalp be paid $100, and every squaw scalp $50, and $25 for everything in the shape of an Indian under 10 years of age. People were offered, anybody, this is in the newspaper, they would give you a saddle and a horse to take up this gruesome task. People were hunted in this area. And when you wonder why Native people aren't here now, and why they might even be a little timid, think back to what their grandparents told them. This is an era, even in my grandmother's time, she had to sign a pass. She had to get a pass signed by the Indian agent before she left the reservation in Kahnawake, for any reason. So, children's scalps, $25. Again, we learn history from the past so that we don't repeat it. When this book was going to press with the Blaine County Historical Museum, certain board members took issue with this chapter. And I went to meetings, and I talked to them, and I talked to Lionel Boyer at the Fort Hall Reservation, who was an elder there who was seeing me through the manuscript. And I talked to Sarah Manning, who had just returned from Germany. She went there to study genocide, among other things. And I asked her, how old does a kid have to be to read something like this? She said, well, in Germany, it's included in the curriculum by law. They have to write about the Nazi Holocaust. Well, yes, Holocaust happened here in North America, in case you don't know. Many small Holocausts. Well, maybe one big one. I said, yeah, but the museum doesn't know if I should include it in the book because kids might read it and tourists might read it. I said, how old do they need to be? She said, about that big. Kids can handle this. Kids can handle it, and it might shock someone. But it's not something that needs to be excluded from school curriculum. This is an important part of our history. It's a dark part of our history, and it's one that we are growing from as human beings. There's dark in all of our histories. There's dark in the Mohawk history. There's very dark periods in the Ganyankahaga history, going back 1,000 years in our oral traditions. We maintain that knowledge so that we do not do this again. Simple. Here's some kids, several under 10 years of age, clearly. This is in Haley, 1916. These photographs came to me when I was finishing the book, and it felt very serendipitous or synchronistic, perhaps, because I was still looking for some photos. So hard to find pictures of Native people in the valley, even though we have reports of them being in and out of the valley throughout the early colonial period. And as I looked at this picture, I was sitting on my dining room table, looking out the window a block from here on River Street, and I saw the outline of this hill right here. Now, I've been looking at that hill, especially that little nipple on top there, for a long time now. And I look, and I'm in my kitchen. Oh my God, I'm sitting in the spot where this picture was taken, practically. And I think it is Croy Street right here. And these are some kids still in the blanket. You know, that's a term used to describe people who have not quite assimilated at certain times in colonial history. At that time, if they were still in the blanket, they were still traditional. They didn't wear Western clothing and such. And they were heading over to the butcher shop. They might have been heading over there from Hot Porter Park, which is where people smoked their fish that they caught out of the Bigwood River, and also camped when they came through town. Because as the stories go, the Native people came up the valley to hunt in the fall, and they brought back their deer skins to Fort Hall, and then they would come back the following spring, and they would bring finely tanned gloves. The show bands are very famous for making their gloves. I have a pair myself now. This is a picture that we also put in the book because, does anybody recognize these hills? Dollar Mountain. Dollar Mountain right there. This is Sun Valley, we think in the 1930s or 40s. There was probably a festival or a 4th of July celebration. You can see somebody in a war bonnet on the far side. And this grandfather here pulling a kid in a travaux, which is, you know, an old wagon that people used to use. I also found out about a archaeological site discovered in Elkhorn. This was pretty much common knowledge. There was a small collection at the Museum of Artifacts. And this was inhabited continually for 10,000 years, and inhabited at the time when the first Europeans came through, according to the state archaeologist who I interviewed, Ken Reed. And I don't know what to think of the fact that they named it Indian Springs. Is that an honoring? Is it taking advantage of the history? I don't know. I get confused about these things. But the only way you can even get close to the site now is on a golf cart. And I do believe this needs some signage in our valley. Not for me to decide. The Shoshone-Bannocks might have very good reasons for keeping this quiet, and yet Indian Springs condos. Archaeologist Claudia Walsworth, who provided some information for this book, she's here in the middle of this picture. And this is James Osborne on the left. He came from Fort Hall to do a ceremony in the 1980s to remember the ancestors of the Elkhorn Springs site who were uncovered during this archaeological dig. Claudia's papers Her career papers have been delivered to the Community Library Regional History Department, and I've looked at the index, and there's a lot of historical treasures in there for somebody to write about. Haley Tourist Park, Huck Porter Park. Again, I mentioned that this is where Native people would camp out in this area as they were passing through. This is sometime after the era of being forced incarcerated on the reservation and when vigilantes were hunting people for their scalps. But still, I'm told that people kept a very low profile. D.A. Utz, who was a school teacher here for many years, and she was blind when I met her and interviewed her. She remembers going down there as a little kid and trading this old goat skin to some Indians who came back and brought her a really nice pair of gloves, and she showed me those gloves. These Shoshone, the mountain Shoshone, made bow and arrows, bows that were made of the mountain sheep horns, extraordinarily powerful bows. Nobody else knew how to do this. It's probably a trade secret. I learned in Yellowstone that they melted the horns down in the hot water there to make the bows. These bows were really big trade items for the buffalo hunting cultures because you could shoot clear through a buffalo with these bow and arrows. Those are the Tukadeka mountain Shoshone. I found this picture, almost got suckered into thinking I could use it. Well, it's in the book, but these are not Native people. I researched the guy's name, and when a lawyer friend told me, this is a lawyer from Boise. These are white people. They're dressed up like Indians on Main Street in Ketchum. That's the casino club. This kind of thing used to happen a lot. It is very much frowned upon now, in case you're wondering. And if in case you're wondering why, it is because people were masquerading as Indians when actual Native people were forbidden from wearing their regalia. People who would pretend to be a Native medicine man while actual Native people were getting thrown in jail for practicing their culture, or worse. So this is cultural appropriation, and I always taken up the opportunity to share why it's different. Yeah, you can dress up like a cowboy and go to Main Street. Cowboying it's a vocation, okay? It's not a culture. And regalia, as I described earlier, is oftentimes passed down through generations, has a deep meaning for people. It's not a costume. Now here's a real McCoy Native person on Sun Valley Road, riding in the bareback presentation of Wagon Days a few years ago. There's some bareback horse races that happen at Fort Hall every summer that are extraordinary. If you get a chance to go there for their powwows, these guys are serious equestrian daredevils. Back to Camas Prairie, the deep significance of Camas Prairie. I eventually found a fellow living out there. His name is Wes Fields. This is Wes. He is deceased now. He was a dear man. I went out there with my wife and we interviewed him and his wife, and he told me the story about how his grandfather came in 1906 to Fairfield, to Camas Prairie, from, I think it was in Illinois or something. It was Homestead Act stuff. His family was given 160 acres and they had never seen the place before. This is how the Homestead Act worked. If you didn't happen to be Indian or black or Chinese, the federal government would give you 160 acres. All you had to do was agree to farm it and show up. By the time Wes was an old man, they had 10,000 acres of land because they had slowly bought up and expanded. He was just a wonderful guy, and he remembered when he was a little kid that these Indians would come through and they'd go down into the swamp. The swamp is the Centennial Marsh of Camas Prairie. Fantastic bird watching area for one thing, but these Native people would gather camas bolts, do what Shoshone-Bannock people do. And one day, Wes said, I'm going to go down there and talk to these. He hadn't seen them come back in many years, and so he decided, I'm going down there and follow him. He followed them down and see what they were up to. This is in 2000, so 25 years ago. And he met this fella, Lionel Boyer. Lionel Boyer is, he described himself to me as a retired elder. He was also a former chairman of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes at Fort Hall. And he nicknamed Wes Curly for his hair. These two guys had a lot of fun together. Eventually, Wes and his wife went to Fort Hall to a powwow for the very first time. This is a third generation, fourth generation, I don't know, Idaho guy who's never been to a powwow. There's often a cultural divide here, you know, that people feel like they're not welcome or they're scared or whatever. And what happened is they became good friends. And Lionel said, let's get Camas Lily Days going in Fairfield near Camas Prairie, and that's what happened. And it has a native component to it. And it includes powwow dancers. These are two fancy dress dancers that I went to the powwow there 10 years ago and visited. I don't know that it happens every year, but it is still going. I've met a lot more people from Fort Hall over the years and also from other Indian nations. And one is this gentleman, Leo Airwhite. And he's become a dear friend. And he is somebody who still practices the traditional glove making of the Shoshone-Bannocks. Many people do at Fort Hall. But I interviewed Leo for a story for Smithsonian American Indian magazine. And when you buy his gloves, they smell like smoke because they're smoked by lodgepole pine bark, or lodgepole pine logs, I believe. Anyway, we're trying to gather some deer skins for him because he needs some for this fall. I'm going to put out a poster looking for deer skins. Leo also worked with his friend Daryl Shea, and they created the powwow at Wagon Days. This is what happened a few years ago. I just found out yesterday that the Wagon Days powwow scheduled for this year has been canceled. And it's not due to any strangeness. It's just simply inability to organize dancers and a drum on short notice because there's a lot of big powwows going on and it was just a difficult thing to organize. But they will be back next year until. The bareback riders will be on the parade, so do look for them. Here's some other people I've met. That's Lad Edmo on the left. I've interviewed him and up at Pettit Lake during the documentary that we're working on, filming about the salmon recovery. I'm so sorry I'm forgetting this lady's name next to him. She's written a new book about Sacagawea that is really getting a lot of press. She's also a communications person for the tribe. Somehow I've forgotten her name. And that's Bobette Haskett. And there's Russell Haskett, the father of Timothy Wildcat Haskett, who I met at the Redfish Overhang way back. I have great admiration for these people. They're posing here because I heard they were in town, and I brought them over to the museum in Ketchum. The community library managers, and took a picture of them all there. And Russ and Bobette have given presentations in town, as has several other people. There's been a lot more Native American programming in the valley lately, and I'm really grateful for that. Now, if I have time, I would like to just read something quickly from the book. Is that going to be okay? Do we still have time for that? Okay. And if you want to stay in touch, that's my QR code right there. You can tick, tick. The little dinosaur in the middle. I put this up when I found out that the powwow isn't coming to Festival Meadows, because this is Festival Meadows last year as we first put the GP up. So what I'm going to read is the introduction. And the introduction is written by Lionel Boyer, retired elder of the Shoshone-Bannock tribe. And it took 2 years for us to win his confidence enough with this manuscript to publish this book. It was an uncertain time for us, but it is very important to get that. My name is Lionel Boyer. I'm a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes of the Fort Hall Indian Reservation in southeastern Idaho. Today we are living on a reservation that our ancestors were removed to by force during the encroachment of European immigrants into our lands. A History of Indians in the Sun Valley area is a review and presentation of our ancestors who for thousands of years migrated in the areas in and around Sun Valley for sustenance, relying on the many resources of the area, the plants, animals, fish, and big game. It is noteworthy that Tony Evans could research documents, journals, and stories of the first immigrants into this area, the fur trappers, the homesteaders, and gold miners who first came into the lands of the Niue and Nume speaking peoples about 200 years ago. I speak for the ancestors of many tribes who subsisted throughout the Intermountain West, now known as the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and California, as well as parts of Canada and Mexico. We Native people have a lot of history in this area with many burials and sacred sites that remain undiscovered. During the era of encroachment into native lands in southern Idaho, many bands of our people imperiled themselves, trying to protect themselves and their resources of subsistence. This led the immigrants to ask for protection as they passed through these areas. Treaties were negotiated between our people and the United States government, between band leaders and federally appointed chiefs, to allow safe passage through the Indian territories for immigrants as they pushed on to the land of plenty on the coast. Nevertheless, their passage routes destroyed the subsistence resources of the Indian bands. The history of the original people of these lands is being brought to the attention of readers by individuals who are concerned about the history of this area. I would like to thank them for their efforts, which are honest and caring about the original people and the lands that they were removed from by force or extermination, or taken from them through unprincipled and unjustified means. This book is written to enlighten residents, visitors and their children about the local history of the magnificent Sun Valley area. We're constantly being told that we were never here, but our presence is in the petroglyphs, teepee rings, and other cultural resources. These are traditional artifacts from time immemorial. We continue to come back to the areas of our ancestors to let the communities know that we have not forgotten our past association with these lands. We come to pay homage to the spirits of our ancestors. We let the communities in and around Sun Valley know that we are a living culture, not a prehistoric culture to be forgotten. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll answer questions if we have time. Oh yeah, and we have books for sale.
Sure. So this is weird, but Sandy Obart told me way back that when she was young, the Indians came through and would come up on her parents were afraid because they would come up on the porch with a stick and demand food or I don't know what. I said, what did they want? And she didn't really remember, but she remembered that distinctly in the fall when there were some gatherings down by Hopwood. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I can speak to that from my own research, but to get an authoritative answer to this and probably to any of your questions, you can reach out to the Fort Hall Language and Cultural Preservation Department or the historians that work down there. They probably know a lot more than I do. But I did learn that the Friedman family, I learned this from this is the home in Old Haley that now belongs to the actress Demi Moore, I believe. The Friedman family were very successful merchants, and they would have well, young Lucille Friedman, in her oral history that she gave to the library, said that some days she would wake up in the morning, I think it was in the early summer, and there would be native people all over the lawn, camping out with all their stuff. There was probably a pretty big lawn around the Friedman's house. They were here to trade, and it had become expected. That's what they would do. Now, in terms of asking for food, I've come upon this even reading Pearl Barber's account, and these stories are in my book, of native people kind of bargaining aggressively for food. And you saw the photograph of the young kids going to the butcher's. I can't imagine they were going to say hello. You know, it could be that there was meat there. And I'll just reflect back to Lionel Boyer's comment about the disruption of subsistence life patterns for human beings who had developed a way of living in this country over many, many, many generations. And when the Europeans came through, that was disrupted. It won't surprise me one bit to find out that people were hungry when they're on the road and asking for subsistence. So that's my quick answer to that. Yeah.
I wish I had asked for more of that.
Yep.
Nothing to recognize that seems to be a very sacred spot in Shoshone-Bannock. Have you discussed that with Shoshone-Bannock folks? Are they interested in any recognition there, or would they rather leave it as it is?
Yeah, I've discussed it with some friends from Fort Hall. And I've also, my book is actually sold at Fort Hall as well, so they're familiar with my work there. And I'm going to be sending them a new box of books soon. But when Darrell Shea and Leo Arrowite started the Wagon Days powwow, they gave prayers before it began, because this is a living culture and it's a spiritual expression. And they made it very clear that they were remembering and addressing the ancestors over the hill in Elkhorn, because they're very much aware of what was going on there. They probably have stories of their own involving Elkhorn, just like there's stories about Camas Prairie that link up with the mountain Shoshone. These are things that are not necessarily in my book for certain reasons, but they're aware, and that's all I can say. Yeah.
Tony, do the Shoshone-Bannock have a story of creation?
Yes. Now this is getting into area that I don't really want to discuss or describe, because, you know, these are stories that are probably very much a part. Creation stories are part of the organization of human development and how we see ourselves in the world, how we see ourselves in relation to one another in the natural world. And so I will not speak specifically about what I learned in the Shoshone and Bannock traditions, which is very little, by the way. But I did have a conversation with Nolan Brown recently, who is now the director of the Language and Cultural Preservation, or maybe he's simply working there, but he's very integral to the education of the outside world about Shoshone-Bannock tribes. And I was telling him a story about when I was working with some people at the Wind River Reservation, and I asked them about their creation story. And there are some similarities with the Kanyankahaga creation story, in that there's a ball of mud that is at the origins of the story. For the Mohawks, the mud gets on the back of a turtle. But there was a primordial sea of water in the original Shoshone story that a man told at the Wind River Reservation. So I remarked on this to Nolan, and he said, you know, there's a lot of similarities to creation stories as you go. And so, but the actual story in a nutshell, if that's what you're asking for, is far less important than the people who teach it and the way they teach it for particular reasons at certain times. And so this is it's not a cultural artifact, it's something that is a living part of a culture, and I would know very, very little about their creation story. I can talk all day about mine.
Take two more.
Tony, could you please pronounce the first two syllables of your Mohawk name? I couldn't tell whether it was like a Gaga or a Tata or
Daga.
Gaga.
Daga.
Okay, like a hard G.
Daga Runyage.
Okay.
It wasn't the way I pronounced it.
Hi, Tony.
Hey.
Could you tell me where the word Idaho came from? And
You got
I
it,
have
you
a
got it.
second comment that
No.
I believe the courthouse here was the center, was created for the Northwest Territories by Abraham Lincoln as they were pushing the railroad east and west down in the south. And the word Alturas disappeared, but that was present when the courthouse was built.
I'll just say, this is asking about the name of Idaho. I've heard some pretty good stories about that, including from Leo Arrowhite, but I can't be sure. I just don't know. But ask Leo Arrowhite, he'll tell you where the name came from. It's hilarious.
Okay, the person who introduces always gets asked the last question. I was really interested in your article on decolonizing the historical placards and signs. To what extent are they actually being changed? And who do you actually think
Well, I
knocked
checked up
that
a few
sign
months
down?
ago. I called the State Historical SHPO, what's it called? State Historical Preservation Office. And I spoke to an associate of the source I originally contacted there years ago. And they didn't share too much,
Yeah.
but it was clear that political concerns might be affecting the progress, let's say. And I shared with them a story that I've had a story killed at the Smithsonian in recent months after January, a story about national parks. I was interviewing Charles Sams, former director of the national parks, and several other people had been putting this together for months for the American Indian magazine. Now, I would think always the Smithsonian is beyond reproach.
Yeah.
And yet, that story went away. And it was about tribal co-stewardships of national parks, more than 100 of them, new tribal co-stewardships, sharing opportunities between Indians and non-Indians, and education opportunities for the general public in our national parks. I'm a huge fan of the national parks, and I really wanted to write this story, but it was killed.
Yeah, I
I'm
say
just going
that.
to share that with you to let you know that there is a change going on with regard to who gets to control our history here in the United States. And there's an old saying that if you can control the history, you can control the future, which is, I have no interest in controlling the future, but I do believe that free speech, I still live in a country of free speech, and when people get intimidated, I get angry.
Yeah.
I don't work for President Trump, so I feel like I'm free to express myself. But a lot of people, including the Smithsonian, they're controlled by federal funding.
Yeah,
So-
and I always like to say that you kept saying that history, we learn from history and et cetera, which is true, but history is also a conversation with the present. And the way we've been writing about history in the late 20th century, it being more inclusive, more affirming of different people in that history.
Yeah.
history is a conversation with the present, and I'm concerned that that conversation with the present is what your warning is about.
I feel like there's room for us all.
Yeah, for
You
sure.
know,
No, absolutely.
That's my feeling.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
All right, we want to thank you, Tony.
thank you.
I want to thank the Haley Public Library, and books are over there, and I'm sure you'll converse as you sign.
Thank you. Please step aside over here to sell you some books.